When you join ASUG, you'll never face an SAP challenge alone again. We connect our members to exclusive educational opportunities and a community of like-minded peers, so you can get the most value from your SAP investment. Get smart fast and learn from the best. Stay on the leading edge of SAP practices and get access to the latest research, insights, and unbiased editorial and interviews from industry experts and your peers. Expand your network. ASUG makes up the biggest, most diverse, and most engaged SAP user group in the world. Any question or challenge you have, there's someone who's seen it before. Connect with a network of 130,000 plus SAP savvy professionals to solve complex business challenges, work smarter, and expand your SAP skills. Get set to lead. Improve your SAP expertise by collaborating with peers to solve business challenges and find innovative solutions. With 38 regional chapters, you and your teams can connect and meet with other SAP professionals and take advantage of dozens of speaking and leadership opportunities throughout the year where you can share your ideas. Become a leader in the ASUG community by leading a local chapter, joining our executive exchange, and participating in one of our 13 and growing ASUG Alliance groups, or make connections and learn at ASUG events. Keep learning, connecting, and growing with ASUG.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today and welcome to SAP S/4HANA on the Horizon, ensuring compliance with smarter access controls. I'm Heather Lima and I'm a content producer here at ASUG. Today's webcast will be recorded and you will receive a post-event email with a link to the on-demand recording along with a link to the survey. Please go ahead and forward that link to the on-demand recording if you think it's useful to any of your colleagues, and please take a moment to take that 2-question survey. It will pop up on your screen at the end of the webcast as well. If you have any questions, please go ahead and enter them in that Q&A box. We'll be taking questions at the end of the webcast, and anything that we don't get to today, we can answer offline. Now I'll hand the webcast off to our speaker, Carrie Bauman, Senior Director of Product Marketing with Pathlock. Carrie, please take it away.
Thank you so much. All right, so let's just jump right in. So S/4HANA on the horizon, ensuring compliance with smarter access controls. We all know a lot of change is coming. And so that's what I want to talk about today is how do we take those changes and make the most of them by enabling better compliance as we go through that shift. So just a quick background on myself. As mentioned, my name is Carrie Bowman. I work for a company called Pathlock as a Senior Director of Product Marketing. And my background is actually SAP specific. So prior to working in the software side of the house, I spent over 12 years in consulting. So I was actually an SAP security admin. I would do SAP security design and redesign, as well as access controls and other GRC solution implementations, with a focus in governance processes, risk rule set customization, and risk remediation efforts. And so this is a topic that is near and dear to my heart, all things compliance. I do have my CISA as well. So understanding that audit side of the house, along with what it feels like to actually be the SAP security admin on the other side, so that you're trying to balance what's required of you to be compliant, but also what you have to do to support the business. So it's just a particular area of interest to me to be able to talk about topics like this and how we can balance both of those things as we move through these significant changes that are coming our way. So for today, I'll kind of take it into 3 parts. So challenges, understanding what this end of maintenance impact is, how that's going to change our ways of working, and then talking through solutioning. How do we strategically plan for a successful migration? So we may not have a choice about this change, but how can we be most effective with determining how we move forward there? And then what are the benefits out of it? So how do we modernize and streamline across our business processes, our identity and access risk management to make the most out of this? And with that, I will jump right in. So challenges, understanding that end of maintenance impact. So common compliance challenges range from an evolving system landscape and business processes, your hybrid and your multi-cloud app environments, adding complexity. So if we think about this, right, this is where we are moving in particular from ECC to S4. We tend to see a significant increase in the number of cloud applications that we are having to add into our ecosystem, right? Be that Ariba, Concur, Fieldglass, or it could be additional non-SAP applications like a Salesforce or a Coupa, a Manhattan Warehouse, Slackline. As we add in additional applications, that's going to make our environment more complex for us to manage as a whole. Identity and access governance becoming spotlighted around security. So any major transition project is going to gain the attention of audit and become something that we need to ensure that we are successful at. And then that high change visibility, also including oversight from audit. So making sure that they're included in the process throughout is going to be key to making sure that we're successful. So these are common challenges that we run into, but they're obviously far more. Another main one that I see, especially with the move to S4, is the changes to business processes. So, are we maintaining the same business processes, or are we going to need to make adjustments based on the feature functionality that we're making use of in S4? And that can be especially impacted depending on if we're moving to S4 public cloud versus private, and if we're using any of the functionalities around RISE and core and everything else. So a lot of change. And how do we manage that? That's something that is a common challenge. Now, other challenges include what it looks like to make these changes. So there's actually a crazy statistic around the fact that 75% of cloud failures are resulting from inadequate management of identities, access, and privileges. So while we have these common challenges with any large transition project, we also have these wild statistics around just the existence of the access and how people can utilize it and what that may result in. And so what this is basically saying is that, regardless of where you are in that migration journey, 3/4 of cloud failures are specifically associated with our ability to manage identity and the privileges. So what people can do in our system and when. And this is really compounded when we think about what we have to deal with as IT or security staff. So 62% of companies surveyed specifically noted that their teams were understaffed, and the top in demand skill, 49%, about half, were saying it's identity and access management. So if we look at the challenges we talked about in the prior statistic, what are we seeing? We're seeing a compounding vision of we have significant changes coming that require specialized skill sets. We know that if we do not manage this correctly, 75% of the time, failures associated with this in the realm of security are specifically because we have not managed the identity and access correctly. And more than half of our companies are there saying that we're understaffed and don't have that skill set specifically. So it's setting up to be a significant challenge if we don't have that skill set or enough of those people. And that's a main reason why we fail to be compliant. And add on top of that all the changes we're going through, it can make it really difficult for us to be successful. And so we really want to try to plan around that. So when we talk in the next stage around solutioning, that is something that I like to talk through, is how do we, as much as possible, mitigate these risks, the risk of being understaffed, the risk of those failures associated with identity management. And then along with that, 60% of internal controls budgets go towards SOX compliant. Now, not all of us may work for companies that are subject to SOX. We may not be public. But if we're doing audit of any kind, there's typically a very large percentage of that budget that is associated specifically with compliance, specific testing and controls. So what that says is we spend a lot of time and money trying to ensure that our systems are compliant, and we have a lot less staff to keep ourselves compliant than we would like in the best case scenario. So how do we address all of this, right? What do we do about this? Well, the first thing we have to acknowledge is the fact that even though all of these challenges are significant, we do not necessarily have a choice. So we may want to say, can I avoid making this transition? Can I put it off longer? But really, there are significant impacts that come along with those delays, especially if you're a publicly traded company. So we think about things like security risks. As soon as the software goes unsupported, right, we're no longer doing maintenance and patches, we're vulnerable to cyber attacks, to security breaches. So that is a significant risk that we take on if we go out of maintenance for something. Compliance issues, if we're trying to justify to audit that we can still maintain compliance, but we're doing that with an unsupported system that may have that exposure to security risks, that makes it extremely difficult for us to gain their sign off as us being compliant. And then just a lack of support and maintenance in general. Anything that's unsupported means if we lose it and we go production down on something, we don't have the support of that major company. So if that is, whether that is our ECC system, if that is SAP Access Controls, if that is SAP IDM, all of those that we're going to talk about today in terms of that end of maintenance announcement, if we go out of maintenance for any of those, we're really on our own for determining how we're going to support if we run into any issues. And that can be a significant lift on our teams. So really just thinking through all of those things, what it comes down to is we have to make these changes. There's significant risk if we were to delay. And we know there's a lot of challenges associated with making these required changes. It's definitely not easy. And what does this timeline look like? Well, as I mentioned in the previous slide, we have 3 big changes coming in the next 6 years. We have SAP AC12, SAP IDM, and SAP ECC, all of which have been announced for a 2027 end of maintenance and a 2030 end of extended maintenance. So while it will be more expensive to do that extension of end of maintenance to 2030, it is an option. But really, at the end of the day, all that this means is we have 6 years in total at most. And I say 6 years, but it is the end of 2024 now, so a little less than that. But we need to identify, implement, and go live with our replacement solution in that time frame. Now, for some of these, like an SAP Access Controls change, that's usually a far faster cycle for us to identify what our next steps will be and to implement that replacement. But for an identity management system, like an SAP IDM transition project, you're talking months to years to be able to execute a project like that. And for something like a move to S4, you're talking years in the making for planning and executing that transition. So if we have 6 years to do this, we really need to start as soon as possible in executing that change, because the longer we wait and the closer we get to that deadline, the more of a challenge it will be and a time crunch for us to be able to execute successfully. And so what are we looking at whenever we talk about changes? There's really a couple different ways to think about the challenges that we're going to incur when we make these changes and weighing what the right choice is for us. So really, we kind of have, in all of these cases, 2 options. We have a technical migration or a business transformation. And one of my colleagues likes to say, what game are we playing here? So we have to weigh the risk, the time, and the impact. So as we can see on the left-hand side there, we've got a technical migration option. This is going to be, we're going to move to the new product. So we're trying to go one-to-one, swap over to the new product, keep our existing functionality, not rock the boat, not change much. And once we make it over there and we stabilize our environment, then we might look at optimizing. So this is the one where we're trying to make the changes that are required, but with the most minimal impact to everyone from IT to audit to our business users. And then there's a business transformative approach. And this is where we're saying, you know what, we're going to make this change. Let's go all out. Let's burn down what technical debt we can. Let's simplify our processes, maybe return to standard where we can. We want to enable new capabilities. You know, we use these former products. We now have new ones and new options out. As we move forward to make this change, you know, moving to S4 versus ECC, the addition of new capabilities, what do we want to take advantage of there? And changing business models or markets. We may have, for example, a common use case that I hear from customers I work with is, you know, they've done mergers and acquisitions. And so they've acquired multiple instances of ECC that are not connected, that are sitting in different places all over the globe for different teams. And they're utilizing an S4 migration as an opportunity to consolidate those. Similarly, they may have multiple instances of access controls, and they're utilizing this change as an opportunity to standardize and centralize those. So these are more difficult projects, right? They're going to take more time. They're more impactful in terms of change. They are riskier because it's more moving parts. It's more change coming, but we can gain a significant amount of value for those. So we really have to weigh those pros and cons of each and decide which of these approaches we're going to take. And again, when we talk about this in the context of challenges, thinking back to those things that we mentioned, right? Do we have the staff to do this? Do we have the budget, the time? Are we meeting audits compliance requirements based on the decision that we make? So we have to weigh all of those things as we decide which of these is going to be our approach. And so now that I've kind of laid the groundwork to say, okay, well, this is really big change coming and it's going to be painful and there's significant challenges. Let's talk about something more positive, which is solutioning. So how do we strategically plan for a successful migration? Well, the first step in any of these is the planning itself. So I always recommend that we follow successful project management principles. Having been a project manager, I tend to take a fairly pragmatic and prescriptive approach to things. And that's mostly because if I can plan for 90% of it, when the 10% that goes sideways, I have more bandwidth and more capability to take on those tasks and be successful in addressing them. So the more that we can plan and really standardize, the more that's going to help us to be successful. So what are some of those principles that we want to think about? One is management support. I always say that we are not going to be successful if we do not have that top-down executive support. It is necessary for them to acknowledge the importance of the project, the value of it, and the team members who are going to be involved. Because depending on which of these projects we're taking on, if it's an S4 migration, an IDM, an SAP IDM transition, an SAP Access Controls transition, that impacts every area of the business. That impacts audit. It impacts our IT team who supports or utilizes those tools or applications, and it also impacts our business users. And so it's important that we understand what that is. For a business user during an S4 HANA migration, I have seen projects where they actually, for the space of 2 years, completely transition jobs and become wholly focused on the S4 migration itself. And there's someone else that takes on their day-to-day operational job within the business. And then when the transformation is complete, they move back into that position. But that's quite an impact to someone's daily job. Then I've seen different ones where, for example, in an IDM or identity management transition or an access controls transition, you're looking at more like for the space of a certain number of weeks out of the year, you're assisting with UAT testing as a business user. And so that's just a certain part of your day dedicated to doing something additional. So there's a broad range of what that impact can look like. And it's important that we know what that is and that we have management support, because management are the ones who are going to enable us to gain the access to those users that we need across IT, business, and audit, and the support that we need to be able to execute. So it's really, really critical that we start with that first and foremost. And then a clearly defined timeline, responsibilities, and milestones with the owners of those tasks agreeing on it. And that's because if we don't know how long it's going to take, we can't adequately identify how long we're going to need those resources for. And if we don't know who is responsible for different tasks, we won't know when we need their time. And we also want to make sure that we all agree on those milestones. So when are we trying to execute different pieces? And then understanding the impacts to all those parties. Kind of the example I gave earlier, is this just an additional job responsibility for someone for a set period of time, or is this a complete transition in their day-to-day that they're going to be taking on as part of these projects? So understanding that is going to help us to build the team that we need. And that's really the next step that I want to talk about, which is the planning and assessment. So once we have, kicked off the initial state of saying, okay, we're going to tackle this project, how do we actually go about assessing what we need to do and really detailing out that project plan. The first step is going to be that evaluation. So what are our current systems and tools? So think of assembling a cross-functional team. So we need those IT, business, and audit representatives, and we need them to help us define and manage and execute this project. And we also need them to help us assess what our current state is. So if we're moving to S4, what are all the business processes that we are executing in ECC today? And are they all going to transition to S4? Are they going to be that kind of technical migration that I mentioned, where we're going to try as much as possible to do a one-to-one lift and shift? Or are we expecting to change our business processes in any way? For IT, what does it look like in terms of our role design that we're going to build in S4? Is it the same? Is it different? Audit, are there any implications for compliance and how audit's going to be looking at the different systems that we need to be aware of? If we're changing off of SAP IDM or access controls, same questions apply. What are all the systems that are integrated with IDM and access controls, and do we anticipate that changing? So for example, if today we're just integrating access controls or IDM into a major SAP ECC system and nothing else, maybe a BI system or something, but really narrowly focused. And we decide that tomorrow, when we move to S4, or if we're already on S4 and we are upgrading these systems, maybe we want them to connect to more. We think about that cloud application comment. That's typically a common occurrence as we move towards cloud applications. Are we instituting Ariba? Are we instituting Coupa or Salesforce? Anything like that that audit's going to determine is now in scope for us. If so, we should consider if we want our identity solution and our access risk management solution to integrate into additional systems so that we can manage risk within those. So we have to do that assessment as a team and understand that, because that has significant implications for the solution that we choose and how we choose to implement it. Key functionalities that are in use for each connected system. So I gave the example of your business processes needing to transition over and if those are changing. But similarly, if we're using an access controls, are we using it for all the feature functionality? Are we doing firefighter? Are we just running risk analysis? Are we using provisioning and running preventative risk checks during provisioning? Are we performing user access reviews with that tool? Is that something we're interested in using going forward? Similarly, for identity management, are we going to consider connecting into our HR source of truth so we can automate some triggers so that when someone joins the company, we can automatically create their access in various applications? And if they were to leave the company, we can automatically revoke that access. So take some of those keep the lights on tasks off of the plate of our IT team. All of those are options, and we want to identify what currently we have in use so that we understand what we do and don't want to transition over. And then determining compliance requirements. So especially in the context of our identity management and our access control solutions that we may be using, as we make a transition to S4, are we going to continue using those same systems? Are we going to meet the compliance requirements as set by audit, or do we need to consider some changes? We have to baseline everything we're doing today so that we can understand if we're going to continue doing exactly that tomorrow or if we're going to have changes to that. And as part of that, we'll want to define what those changes are and the requirements for going forward. And a great way to do this is to build your list of priorities. What are your required must-have functionalities? In S4, what do we absolutely have to be able to perform? In access controls, what do we absolutely have to have access to? With an identity management solution, what must it be able to perform, or what systems must it be able to connect to? And then our nice to haves. It might be nice to have a solution that connects to multiple applications like Salesforce, Coupa, Blackline, S4, but maybe that's just a nice to have for us. Maybe it's not a requirement yet. Audit isn't making us do that cross-application risk check. So we just have to have it connected to our S4 system, but it would be nice if we could future-proof by making sure that we had the functionality to connect to additional applications. That's a very common conversation that I have with customers. Consider the entire application landscape. So again, not just where you are today, but where you plan to go. Try to future-proof as much as possible. And then again, I can state this enough, cross-functional stakeholder conversations. IT needs to understand what matters to business and why, just like business needs to understand the limitations or restrictions that IT has to put in place and what's actually possible for what they may want to do. And then we all need to understand what audit expects of us so that we can meet those requirements when they come due during audit season. Some example questions that I usually ask when I'm talking to customers about this is your landscape SAP only, or are there line of business apps in scope, or that you plan to have in scope within the next couple years? Is your landscape on-prem, cloud, or hybrid? This is impactful for your decision around an identity management solution and an access control solution. You'll need something that has flexibility if you do have that hybrid environment. Do you have identity governance requirements? So I mentioned the example earlier of being able to connect to an HR source of truth system so that you can provision out access automatically, that joiner, mover, leaver. So someone who starts, someone changes a position within the company, or someone leaves the company. How much of that can we automate and take off of the IT team's repetitive tasks? So thinking back to that challenge of more than 62% of companies saying they're short-staffed, and half of that skill set that they're lacking is identity and access management. If we can implement an identity governance solution that can automate a lot of that identity access management capability, what we're doing is taking the burden off of our already short-staffed team because we're automating it and standardizing it. So is that something that's important to us? And what do those requirements look like? How will you manage access risk governance is a really key question to answer. Do you have access controls today? Do you have a different type of solution? Some of you may have PathLock itself, or some of our PathLock native products like Security Weaver that you've used in the past. Or you may be using something like a Greenlight product that is extending your access control solution to additional systems. Or you may be interested in something like a PathLock Cloud that's a centralized capability to perform access risk management across those. You've got lots of options today. So understanding which one of those you want to use and how you'll manage that risk governance. When moving to S4 and thinking about it from a security perspective, I like to say design, assign, control. You can't stand up an S4 instance without designing the access that you're going to be granting to people. And again, this is coming from a security perspective. We must design new roles, right? There's a lot of changes to transactions, to Fiori apps, to the different ABAP programs and authorization objects. So we have to design new roles, and we need to design the access that we're going to grant users. So if there are business process changes, we need to account for those in the role design. And then assign, right? When we stand up our new environment, we have to grant access to users. So how are we going to assign that access to them? Is that assignment of access going to include a risk check for separation of duties, SOD, or sensitive access risks? And once we assign that access out, how are we going to control it? Are we going to be doing user access reviews? Do we want to automate that capability? Do we want our user access reviews to include valuable contextual information like usage and risks associated with that access? Do we want to be doing elevated access management, limiting the sensitive access that people have and utilizing that temporary time-bound firefighter type functionality? All of those are questions that we want to make sure that we answer. Is do we intend to manage risk and govern it? And if so, how? And then do we need any advanced security or controls capabilities? Are we interested in data masking and UI masking? Are we interested in vulnerability management and threat detection? So really, really listing out all the requirements. Again, requirements and nice to haves. What must we have? What will we like to have? And again, I always say, we don't have a choice about this change, but what we can try to do is with these very large projects like this, get as much out of it as we can. If we have wish list items we've been wanting to tackle, how many of those can we get into our requirements list so that we can make the most of this change by getting to actually win at least a little in some of those changes that we've been wanting to see? And then once we define our requirements, we actually need to evaluate and select a vendor. So if it's an S4 migration, we need to select our partner that's going to assist us in that. These are very time intensive projects, very, very large teams that work on them usually. So what does that vendor look like that we select? If we are moving off of SAP IDM, what is our new identity solution that we're going to select? Who is that vendor? How do we select them? And if we're making a change from SAP Access Controls, how do we select that vendor? And what does that process look like? Same steps for all of these, which is once we've established our criteria, so we define the requirements that they must meet, we need to talk through how we're going to select our new solution. So establish a very clear criteria list that we're going to follow through on. So think about scalability, integration capabilities, user experience, list all of those things that were on your requirements of must have and nice to have. And then you also want to rank those. So when you say something is a nice to have, is it your number one nice to have? Is it your last one? And what's going to be the cutoff point where you say a solution doesn't meet your needs? Is it if it doesn't meet all of your requirements, or if it doesn't meet 75% of your requirements? We need to establish exactly what that selection looks like. Then once we do that, we want to do a thorough market analysis. So identification of all the vendors that might meet our use case requirements. I mentioned, PathLock alone has multiple solutions, and we are a singular company. You have SAP Access Controls, you have the PathLocks of the world. There are other options out there. So you need to identify all those that you're going to assess as part of your decision-making period. And then evaluate those vendors. You might do that through an RFP. You might do that through demos. You might ask for customer references. So all of these things are associated with your procurement process. So I find that it's also really important to mention that you should have an understanding of what your procurement process is. I've worked with organizations where you can, evaluate a vendor, and once you select them, you can make it through their procurement team in 2 weeks. And I've worked with companies where it's a 9-month minimum. It is a significant amount of, legal back and forth and lots of steps and sign-offs. And that's really important because if we think about that 2030 deadline, that 6 years that we have to execute on this, if our procurement process takes nearly a year, that's really cutting into the timeline that we have to make this transition. So if we think about working our way backwards from either that 2030 date of end of extended maintenance or the 2027 date of normal end of maintenance, we need to work backwards saying, okay, how long does a project like this take to execute? Okay, subtract that backwards. And then from there, how long does it take to actually get through my procurement process? Subtract that back. How long am I going to take evaluating vendors before I select one to go through the procurement process? Subtract that back. And that can let us know how soon we need to start this process. If it's going to take a year to execute the project, a year to get through procurement, and 6 months to evaluate a solution, then that means we need 2.5 years leeway. So if we're planning on hitting a 2027 date, we should be starting today. And if we're looking for a 2030 date, that gives us a couple of years before we have to kick that project off. But we need to keep those things in mind. So once we do that vendor evaluation and selection, what do? We actually work on the implementation roadmap. So by this point, we should have assessed and understood exactly what we're looking to get out of the transition, what we expect as requirements versus nice to haves, who we selected as a vendor and a partner to implement and to execute with us. And then we want to talk about how that implementation is going to actually run. So we want a comprehensive implementation and migration plan. It should outline the intended approach for all of our cross-functional teams. So it should start with our vendor selection, go through go live, have clearly defined steps, a timeline, resources, and responsibilities. So for each of those steps across that timeline, who's the responsible party? How much time are you allotting them to complete this task? And what does sign off look like? And then setting realistic dates. I always say this because it's far better to be realistic and hit those dates than set goalposts that you're not going to meet, because what that does is every time you miss one of those, it pushes your project back, and it becomes very hard to anticipate when you're actually going to be ready to go live. And that has an impact on everyone, right? The IT team supporting that, the business team who's waiting for this big change to come to them, and audit, who wants to know, when am I going to start changing the way that I audit things? When is this going live? So it's really important to set realistic dates for these things, and to get agreement from everyone on who owns what and when they're going to complete that task. And this is an example of a typical roadmap for an S4 migration. So, we have process improvements that we address. We have data assessments. So we need to look at the quality of our data. We need to determine how we're going to govern our data. We need to think through any future state analytics. For the solution itself, we have to design the solution. So what are we integrating with? What's our architecture setup going to be? What are the security and controls that we're enforcing within the new application? How are we deploying? What's our strategy? Are we doing big bang? Is it phased approach? How are we governing this change? What's our support strategy? So how are we ensuring that the team has what they need once they go live and are through that hypercare phase? And who are the resources that are supporting that? And in the business case, similarly to the way that I've outlined today's presentation, challenges, solutions, and benefits. When you're doing an implementation, as part of that, you should ensure that you have your business case and your measurable success criteria, because this is a massive undertaking that we're going to undergo. And so identifying how we're going to benefit from that is really valuable. So what are the cost estimates? What's our ROI? How are we changing our total cost of ownership? What are those anticipated benefits? And what are those KPIs that we're going to track to? Because again, huge projects like this, at the end of it, we need to know how we define success. So that when we say we've closed this project, it's not just a success because we have closed the project and completed it, but it's a success because we can celebrate together as a team all that we've achieved. And that's not just a go live. That's usually things like a better user experience, less risk, higher compliance, a more effective business process. So we want to establish what that looks like and be able to track to it. And then again, because I do have a security background and also a couple of the other topics here, identity management and access controls that can be impacted by this S4 change. These highlights are just a few of the key areas where in an S4 migration, these topics come up. So when you talk about process streamlining and optimization, that can be really beneficial to consider along with your identity management solution and your access risk management solution. Because as you streamline those processes, it may change the way that you govern access for users. So keeping in mind how you want to do that. Similarly, remediation plans, if you're aware of risks that are occurring, the security and controls that you want to implement, you want to know what tool you're going to be using to enforce those security and controls. Integration points, I mentioned cross-application risk. Is this something we're going to tackle as part of moving to S4? If so, we need to be aware of that, what our governance model looks like, and again, those anticipated benefits. So there's a lot that goes into any one of these changes, be it S4 access controls or IDM changing. And especially if we're doing S4 migration, it really does impact all of those, regardless of if we're changing identity and governance and risk management in the moment or utilizing what we have. It's going to be impactful, so we need to be aware of that. And then lastly, go live and beyond. So the same way that we need a really well executed plan to ensure that we can implement on time, on budget, and with the resources we've allocated, we need to ensure that we have a post go live plan. So that's, what does our handover look like? What does the day-to-day for the users look like going forward? And what does the administration of these systems or tools look like going forward? So we want a well-communicated cover plan so everyone is on the same page. Here are the steps we're following. Here's when we go live, and here's when that change goes into effect. That's going to ensure that we have fewer disruptions and we have everyone understanding the changes that they're going to be seeing when they come into work that next day. We want very robust training. Again, similar to having a really well-defined project plan, because if 90% of the steps in it are controlled, the 10% that always pops up as a surprise, we're more able to manage. Similarly, the better that we train our teams, the more it's going to enable us to tackle those one-off issues that arise. So if we're thinking about an S4 migration, If we did the technical migration, maybe it's going to be minimal changes to their business processes. But if we've undertaken a transformative approach and we have significant business process changes, we're going to need a lot of training to ensure that our teams know how to use the solution. Because if we don't train, for example, our business users well, that all comes back to IT. When they can't make something work or don't understand it, they're coming back to our teams saying, how do I do this? What's wrong with it? Why is it not working? And so we can overburden our IT teams if we do not effectively train the business users. Similarly, if audit is not aware of these changes and they're not trained on the new processes, it can make it really difficult when they come in to perform audits, because we're going to spend a lot of our time trying to explain the new approach to them. If we're a business user or IT, explaining that new approach to audit and getting all the right documentation. So the more we can do up front to negate some of those impacts, the better. And then define our standard operating procedures and support structures. So just like we train, we want our users move jobs. We get in new team members. Some team members retire or leave the company. We have to ensure that we have the ability to onboard those new users in a standardized manner. And that's where standard operating procedures are really valuable. So ensuring that going forward, we continue to have an effective team that knows how to utilize our applications and our solutions. And similarly, support structures. Everyone needs to know what the process is for requesting support. By following that process, it's going to ensure they get a standardized experience for support, but it's also going to enable those support teams to be more impactful and more effective. So we want to ensure that we define all of that as part of our go live and beyond piece of our project. Now, we've done the project, right? We've tackled all the challenges, we've identified our solution, and we've executed it. And we're at that last step in the phase, which is benefits. How do we articulate the benefits that we gained from undergoing these massive projects? I kind of tend to group them into what you see here, which is what did we modernize or streamline? And how was that modernized or streamlined for business processes, for identity management, and for access risk management? So when we think about where our teams are spending time, they spend time on the business processes, they spend time doing identity management, and they spend time doing risk management and compliance. So where did we see the benefits come through? These are the ways that I typically will present this to customers when we're talking. A lot of our benefits fall into two major buckets, which are risks and performance. So we're usually talking about it in terms of lowering our risk and making our performance more efficient, or gaining performance and lowering cost. And we'll group them into these four buckets here. So technology, process optimization, risk and controls, and company and people. So basically people, process, technology, plus risk and compliance. So if we think about technology, we move to S4. We can be more scalable. We can be more cost efficient. We may have better data integrity. If we change from SAP IDM to a different solution, or SAP Access Controls to a different solution that's a centralized risk platform, we become more scalable. We can manage the cross-application risk governance and identity access management, which then can be more cost-effective. We have a lower total cost of ownership if we're using a singular unified platform solution versus multiple point solutions on different systems. If we think about process optimization, that's one of the things that S4 has touted for the longest time, right? Is the speed at which you can do certain things, because the processing power is different within S4 versus ECC. If we think about identity management and access risk governance, with the automation that can be offered through those, we can gain significant efficiencies. And it really improves our resource allocation. So if I can automate those keep the lights on tasks, someone joins the company and I have to create an account for them in SAP and I have to assign a certain amount of access. If I've standardized that, and I've also, through standardization, identified any risks associated with that access and the controls, the mitigating controls the user needs because of those risks, what I can essentially do is automate. Someone joins the company. When HR updates that in their system, it automatically can trigger going out, creating the ID, assigning the access, applying the mitigating control for the risks that are incurred. And I've completely taken my IT team out of that loop. And by doing that, what I'm doing is allowing myself to reallocate those resources to more valuable tasks. So if we think back to the fact that 62% of companies say they're understaffed, and 50% of the thing that they don't have is identity and access management. Another stat in there was something around, I think, close to 40% of the skill set that was missing was around cybersecurity skills. So if we think about making our resource allocation more effective, we take those just repetitive basic tasks off their plate. What we can do is upskill our employees. And that goes into that company and people section there. We think strategy and structure and knowledge and skills. What can we do? We can do more with what we have today. It's hard a lot of times to gain approval to expand our workforce team, but if we are more effectively using our team members and can gain back some of their time that was previously allocated to those just repetitive tasks, what we can do is upskill our existing teams. I have customers who focus on upskilling their teams in cybersecurity specifically, so making them more effective for managing, doing vulnerability management and threat detection scans and things like that. Another one of them actually upskilled their team around the capabilities of AI so that their support team could more effectively answer questions coming in from customers. They utilized AI, they built a chat bot. And so when a question got asked, it would take previous examples that support had granted to different support responses, and it would combine all of those and draft the initial support response. And that was saving literal hours for each question that came through. And they did that with their existing resources by freeing up those resources' time. So there's a lot of opportunity there to both make do with the resources we have, but be more effective. But also a lot of times that makes that job more appealing to those users. It not only makes them more valuable to the company, but it gives them an opportunity to expand their skill set, to gain interest, to do more interesting projects for the company that are really those business value add projects, where you can really see the impact of them. They are knowledgeable, experienced users. So enabling them to do the most that they can with their experience is really valuable to the company. And then that last box there, risk and controls. I say last box, but it's definitely not last in terms of importance. Sustained compliance, as well as things like transparency and operational effectiveness. The more that we can automate and standardize, the more effective we're going to be at being compliant. So if we think about a capability maturity model in audit speak, what that means is as you move upward and towards the right, you're trying to go from manual ad hoc processes to standardized, repeatable processes. Then you automate those processes, and then you optimize those processes. So the more that we can do in terms of automation standardization, it's going to help us be more compliant because it lowers our risk. So that example around we move to S4, we change our business processes, make them more efficient and more effective. We implement a new identity management solution, a new access control solution to manage our risks and our users, and we automate that. What we're doing is standardizing the way in which we provision and manage access and risk. And so that is going to enable us to be more compliant. So again, these are typical ways in which we talk about building that benefits section for customers as they're making these changes. And this is that governance maturity model that I was talking about. And this is just kind of a visual to talk through those steps. So document what you need to do some basic automation, things like provisioning, deprovisioning, creation of users. Think about application access governance, which is that layering of risk in. So running your risk analysis reports, ensuring that when you provision access, you're doing a preventative risk check to address any risk before you provision access out, considering things like firefighter and emergency access so that you're not provisioning standing access to sensitive functionality to users. And then looking towards optimizing, doing continuous monitoring of the controls that you've put in place, making sure those controls are operationally effective through automation, possibly quantifying your risk, so that you actually have dollar amounts associated with your risk exposure as a company, considering things like data masking. All of those are really valuable functionalities that we can implement as we mature as an organization. And then what does it look like when we try to articulate this to the company in terms of benefits related to risks and capabilities or efficiencies? I like to use a very simple example, which is when you're doing everything manually, it's very high risk, right? It may not be always repeated in the same manner. That can be, very risky. But what's the next step we take? Typically, we implement a traditional identity solution. This is great. It's like an SAP IDM. It's associated to one specific application. It automates people joining the company, so provisioning. It can automate deprovisioning of access, and it can automate user access reviews or certifications. That's great. Those three functionalities add value to the company, and they lower our risk slightly because now we're automating that. It's not a manual process where we might have human error in forgetting to take access away from someone or unintentionally giving them something they shouldn't have. So this is great. We lower our risk, we gain value, we gain efficiencies. But what about whenever we then do centralized identity governance? So it's no longer just identity management for SAP, but it's identity management for SAP S4, for Ariba, for Coupa, for Blackline, for Salesforce. If we've done a lot of mergers and acquisitions, we might even have some Oracle systems. So it is standardizing that identity governance across all of those applications. So it's the same functionality, provisioning, deprovisioning, and certifications, but now we're doing it for more applications. So we have more value for the same task being performed. And again, our risk continues to go down because now we've standardized the process across multiple of the applications in our landscape. So lowering risk, increasing value and capabilities. What's the next step that we can take? Well, we can think about access risk management. Traditional access risk management, like in access controls, is focused on our major ERP application, like an SAP, ECC or S4 instance. Now, there is significant value added here. You're talking about adding in the capability to do risk analysis and remediation, and you're looking at the capability to do things like emergency access management. Those are really valuable functionalities that can help us lower our risk exposure as a company. So very valuable functionality. It helps us identify our risk across the environment, right? But what's even more effective is if we centralize all of that. So if we have a singular platform that's going to do our identity governance and layer in our risk management, so we've got that application access governance functionality. So we are provisioning, deprovisioning, doing certifications, managing risk, managing elevated temporary access, and we're doing that across our application landscape. That functionality just continues to compound in value for us. And it's lowering our total cost of ownership, right? Because we're using a single centralized approach to do all this functionality. And again, it's going to lower our risk because now we have visibility into the risk across all these applications that we've connected into. And so every decision we make, from provisioning to a user access review and who retains access, now we have that risk view identified across all of those. And so it's going to make our decisions far more valuable in terms of how we allot access and manage risk. And then lastly, we can add in additional functionality like continuous monitoring. And that's going to lower our risk even more because now we're continuously monitoring our environment and we can even quantify risk. So again, lowering our risk, increasing value, really being able to clearly show benefits to the organization after all that effort we put into these changes. And really quickly, I'll go through this, just a couple slides really quickly here. I would be remiss if I didn't talk about how a product like PathLock can help you achieve those benefits I just discussed. One, the identification and mitigation of SOD risks for both SAP and beyond. Oftentimes, we help companies who need to do this before they do their migration. So they're in ECC, they're about to migrate, and they want to identify the risks that they have today before they make that change. They need to do cross-system risk analysis, so SAP and beyond, and they would like the benefit of some out-of-the-box workflows or functionalities. Similarly, for user access reviews, with workflow-driven approvals, they want to be able to do this for beyond just SAP, and they want to include contextual information like risk. There's a 10x component. If you're doing a user access review, so what roles are assigned to users, there's a revocation rate, usually around 2 to 3%. If you let them know the access is causing risk and the access is not being used, you see something like 20 to 30%. So you can significantly reduce your risk exposure as a company just by giving them that additional information. Complete audit trail, so the ability to do that emergency or firefighter access and do it beyond just SAP, for Oracle, for Salesforce, for Fieldglass, for Concur, being able to give people temporary access and pull change logs once they've used that access, really, really valuable for showing audit that you're being compliant and you're being secure. And then lastly, pre-built reports. So really taking advantage of what is audit looking at every time. Let's just use a report that's standard and allow them to access that. It's going to make it so much quicker for us to move through reviews with them. Having standard risk reports that we make use of. Trending and dashboards, having built-in trending so that you don't have to export all that information and create your own dashboards. It's really nice to click a button and have it build the trend report for you. So making it really user-friendly. That's one of the things we talk about, is that our team of CISAs and our team of practitioners are people who actually lived the life, right? I spent more than 12 years actually living the life, using these tools, helping customers use them. We have multiple other people who've done the same. So we really take an end user approach when we're implementing our tool and when we're updating our product and doing innovations and enhancements. It really is important to us that it is an ease of use exercise for users, and that it's really valuable information that we include for them, because we have been the end users. And so we want that experience to be good. And then the last thing is that unified access policy. So taking that broader approach, not just solely focusing on SAP, but on all those maybe cloud applications that came in as we did our migration, and being able to address all of those, and also being able to address any other systems that we have in use in our environment. So are we using, for example, Microsoft Intra ID? Are we using maybe a SailPoint? Do we have ServiceNow? Do we have Jira? Anything like that that we may be using that we want to integrate, so we have a closed loop process that includes our provisioning, our risk management, our identity management, and really making it a smooth process. That's something that is worth considering as you go forward. And so in summary, what can all of this benefit you as you make these moves? 70% cost reduction. This is really common because we're reducing the cost of compliance through automation. 50% task reduction. Again, repetitive, keep the lights on tasks or business processes that take longer to do. If we can standardize those, automate them. Significant task reduction. Let's go upskill our workforce and make more use out of them for those business value add projects. And a risk reduction. If we make users aware of the risk that's incurred with the access they retain, we have a significantly better chance of getting them to revoke access that's unused, and ensuring that they are just aware of that risk so that they can more appropriately monitor it. And so just enabling the business to understand who has access to what and what they're doing with it is really, really valuable. And it shows a tangible risk reduction for the company. And so with that, I know there's only about 2 minutes left, but I will ask Heather, as part of the Q&A session, if we have any questions that have popped into the box.
Hey, Carrie, thanks so much for that. That was really informative. So now's the time to ask your questions. So please go ahead and put them in the box if you have any questions. And in the meantime, the first question is the recommendation then to use only one tool for identity and access risk governance? And what if we already have an IGA tool?
Yeah, so a lot of the organizations who are going through an S4 migration or planning one, you may not have SAP IDM. You may already have like a SailPoint I mentioned earlier, or Microsoft Intra you may be using. So no, you don't always have to use one single platform. I showed there the benefits of doing that, but it's different for every company. So if you already have an IGA solution, find a solution that will do the risk management piece and hook into those and integrate, right? We are partners with Microsoft, so we can do that if you have Microsoft Intra ID. So that's an example of where you can keep what you have and just build on it and make it more valuable. If you don't have either, then I would strongly suggest that you consider an application that can do both, because again, thinking about total cost of ownership and the return on investment that you get from, only maintaining and using one platform versus two or more is pretty obvious. So I think it depends on where you're at today with your company and what your goals are as well.
Awesome. Thank you. So do you typically see companies undertake all of these changes at once, or do they usually stagger it?
So I would say it's usually staggered in the sense of the S4 migration projects usually are years long. And so I will see something like an implementation of the new access control solution or new risk management solution, and then the identity program. And those can be ongoing while the S4 migration is happening. And then when the S4 migration goes live, they're linked into those products. So it's, I guess, big bang in the sense of you're technically doing all three at once, but because the identity solution or the access risk management solution are usually faster projects to complete, they usually do get completed prior to the S4 migration. So they stagger and go live, but can all be worked on in tandem.
Awesome. So we have one last question, or time for one last question. So the question is, we currently have GRC installed on S4. How do we incorporate PathLock CCM?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you have, I'm assuming when you say GRC that you mean SAP Access Controls solution. If that's the case, you have options with PathLock. So depending on if you prefer to go through SAP on SAP paper or directly with PathLock, either way, we do have an option. We are an SAP partner. And so CCM, if you go through SAP, you'll hear it referred to as AVMRA, or Access Violation Management Risk Assessment. That is that kind of CCM capability. Or we have on PathLock Cloud, which I do have a tendency to prefer because PathLock Cloud is, our platform that we maintain, and it has additional functionality beyond just the like risk quantification, or it has like the full controls management. You can talk about event and configuration notifications and things. So it's even more robust. But in both cases with that CCM, you can actually stand it up. You can integrate it into your SAP environment and gain those reports. So as far as incorporating PathLock into CCM, what we would do is identify the risks from your access control solution that you want to manage and continuously monitor, and the controls associated with those that you want to continuously monitor. And we would implement those in PathLock CCM capability and allow you to then monitor and manage those through CCM. So it's using what you've already built in access controls in terms of the risks and the controls, and then monitoring those through the CCM product.
Nice. Well, thank you so much. We are out of time, but this was really informative, and I really, really enjoyed this webcast. And thank you to all of you who tuned in. As I mentioned before, you will receive an email with the link to the on-demand presentation of this webcast. Please go ahead and watch it over the holidays, send it to your colleagues who might be interested. And in the meantime, please take that 2-question survey when it pops up on your screen. Thank you so much, and have a very happy holidays and great rest of your day.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.